small computer, but it seems to work, which is good.
So now you're being recorded. The meeting's being recorded. They're letting you know that.
Okay, I'm all set.
Excellent. I am as well. So, okay, let's see here. So I just started the recording, so I'm letting everybody know that this will be recorded. So welcome everyone. My name is Nathan Silverstein. I'm the founder and president of the Polish Club at the University of Texas at Austin. As I said, this will be recorded and it will be up on our website, which just launched a couple days ago, www.texaspolishclub.com. And we have a virtual library of recordings of all our past speakers. Before I begin my introduction, UT Professor Emeritus Roger Lewis would like to make some introductory remarks about Dr. Norman Davies. He and Dr. Davies are longtime friends. He will do so now.
My name
You're on mute.
You're muted, Professor Lewis.
Okay.
We can hear you now.
Okay, my name is Roger Lewis. I'm the Kerr Professor of English History here at UT and an old friend of Norman Davis. He and I are both fellows of St. Anthony's College, Oxford, and we both studied under the famous historian A.J.P. Taylor, and we share the same publisher, Oxford University Press. Now, Nathan Silverstein will give you more details and a rounded account of Norman Davis and the reasons he is so famous in Polish history, so famous as to be invited to speak to the UT Polish Club. Here, I'll simply make a few points about two of his books. One of them, perhaps the most famous, God's Playground, A History of Poland. And the phrase God's Playground is an allusion to a 16th century poet indicating in this context that the history of Poland can be viewed as a history of mankind. It weaves together the Ukrainian, Lithuanian, German, and Jewish communities in the Polish context and pursues the theme of Poland joining the European Union in 2004. God's Playground is commonly regarded as the best book on Polish history in English. The other book that I want to mention is his book bearing the title The Isles, commonly known as the British Isles, but Norman Davis's purpose is to emphasize the four component parts rather than the usual dominant British theme. In other words, a history of Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, as well as England. It reverses the Anglo-centric or British theme. In other words, by emphasizing the cultural history of the four components. And the result is iconoclastic. Iconoclastic in the sense that it rebels against British history and offers a rather jolting challenge to the history of the British Empire as well as Britain itself. This, in other words, is a fundamental work that stands alongside his history of Poland. In his famous work on Polish history, he emphasizes Ukrainian dimension as essential to Polish history itself. And I therefore hope that perhaps in the question section of today's presentation, that he can be persuaded to say a few words about Poland and the Ukraine.
Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Professor Lewis, very much for your remarks. So again, I would like to welcome everyone and thank you all for being here. I'm required by the University of Texas at Austin's policies regarding student organizations to read the following disclaimer. Tonight's event is being hosted by the Polish Club at UT, a registered student organization. This is not an event sponsored by the University of Texas at Austin. The views expressed tonight are of the student organization / invited guest speaker and do not represent the views of the university or its officers. I would also like to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors. Joining us today is the Polish Consulate in Houston, the Polish American Council of Texas, or the PACT, the Austin Polish Society, or APS, the Polish Heritage Center, UT's Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, UT's Center for European Studies, UT's Department of History, UT's Department of Government, UT's Students for Central and Eastern Europe, and the Texas A&M Polish Association. We thank you all for being here. With that said, I am thrilled to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Norman Davies. Dr. Davies is a Welsh-Polish historian. He is best known for his work on the history of Europe, Poland, and the United Kingdom. Dr. Davies is a professor emeritus at University College London, a visiting professor at the College de Europe, and an honorary fellow at St. Antony's College, Oxford. He was formerly the UNESCO professor at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. Dr. Davies earned his BA in history from Magdalen College, Oxford in 1962, his MA from the University of Sussex in 1966, and his PhD from the Jagiellonian University in 1968. Starting in 1971, Dr. Davies taught Polish history at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies of University College London, where he was professor from 1985 to 1996. Afterwards, he became supernumerary fellow at Wolfson College, Oxford, from 1997 to 2006. Dr. Davies has lectured in countries around the world, including Australia, Japan, and most of Europe. Dr. Davies has published many books, but for the sake of time, we will focus on the ones about Poland. In 1972, Dr. Davies published White Eagle, Red Star, the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 through 1920. In 1981, Dr. Davies published God's Playground, which is considered the definitive history of Poland. In 1984, Dr. Davies published Heart of Europe, a briefer history of Poland. In 2000, Dr. Davies's Polish publisher Znak published a collection of his essays and articles under the title The Wawel Dragon on the Thames. In 2001, Dr. Davies published Heart of Europe, the Past and Poland's Present. In 2002, Dr. Davies wrote a history of the Polish city Wrocław titled Microcosm, Portrait of a Central European City. In 2003, Dr. Davies published a history of the Warsaw Uprising titled Rising 44, The Battle for Warsaw. In 2012, Dr. Davies published the story of Polish captain Witold Pilecki called The Auschwitz Volunteer, Beyond Bravery. In 2015, Dr. Davies published Trail of Hope, The Anders Army, An Odyssey Across 3 Continents. Dr. Davies also writes articles for the mass media. He has written for the BBC, The Times, the New York Review of Books, and The Independent. Dr. Davies is an incredibly decorated historian. President of the Polish government in exile, Edward Bernard Raczyński, decorated Dr. Davies with the Order of Polonia Restituta in 1984. In 1998, Polish President Aleksander Kwaśniewski decorated Dr. Davies with the Grand Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland. In 2012, Dr. Davies was decorated with the Order of the White Eagle, Poland's highest civilian award. In 2014, Dr. Davies was granted Polish citizenship. He has honorary doctorates from the Jagiellonian University and the universities of Lublin, Gdańsk, and Warsaw. Dr. Davies is an honorary citizen of the Polish cities of Warsaw, Wrocław, Lublin, and Krakow. Today, Dr. Davies will be delivering a speech entitled Assimilation in Historic Poland. However, given the current war in Ukraine, Dr. Davies will be directing his remarks on assimilation more to Ukraine, 400 years of Polish rule, 300 years of Russian rule. Before we start today's event, I would like to provide everyone with a brief roadmap of how the event will proceed. Dr. Davies will speak for 45 minutes to an hour. He will then take Q&A for 10 to 15 minutes. Q&A will be open, meaning that everyone is free to ask questions. We just ask that attendees not ask overtly political questions. We also ask that attendees ask questions related to Dr. Davies' speech topic rather than general questions. I will call on people who use the virtual raise hand feature over Zoom on a first come, first served basis. It is my great honor to now welcome one of the most renowned scholars of Poland in the world, Dr. Norman Davies.
Well, thank you very much, Nathan, for those overkind remarks. I'm delighted to be speaking to you again at UT in Austin, which I visited many decades ago and several times. But as has already been said, today's event is overshadowed by the sad events in Ukraine. So I shall be redirecting my remarks somewhat towards Ukrainian matters. So at the outset, I should make sure that everybody understands that the term historic Poland and Ukraine are overlapping concepts. Today, Ukraine and Poland are separate countries, nations, as you would say in America. But historically, for many centuries, they were bound together. And this, in large measure, explains why Ukrainians are rather different from Russians and have different traditions, different experiences, and a very strong and different identity. Make no mistake, the long history of Poles and Ukrainians has often been conflicted, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries. Nonetheless, the very fact that Ukrainians and their forebears were struggling against domination by Poland gave them a whole series of formative experiences which the Russians, that's the Muscovites further to the east, never possessed. Another preliminary remark about conflicting interpretations of history. Since in recent centuries, the former Grand Duchy of Moscow grew from its modest origins on the Volga into the Russian Empire, the largest empire on earth, stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific. It is the Russian version of history which has been most widely taught and propagated abroad. In most British and American universities, if East European matters are taught at all, it is the Russian take on these matters, as recently expressed in its most vulgar form by Vladimir Putin, which has been most frequently taught to British and American students. Polish, Ukrainian, and indeed Jewish perspectives have not enjoyed the same publicity. And it is the devil of a job to try and sort out fiction and fact and fake narratives. One fact, however, is not in doubt. Ukraine, means the borderlands, the frontier. It is in many ways the counterpart in Europe of the place of Texas on the North American continent. And Ukraine, incidentally, is a very similar size to Texas, which by European standards means pretty big. I fear that I've got too much to say, so I must press on. For those who may be taking notes, I shall be talking on the 7 or 8 headings, including the fate of Ukraine and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Ukrainian experiences in the old Commonwealth, Ukrainian experiences on the successive Russian and Soviet regimes after the partitions of Poland, the 2 world wars, the spectrum of assimilation, and finally, the crystallization of national identity. So here we go. The first heading, the fate of Ukraine under Polish-Lithuanian rule. This is the 14th to the 18th century, a total of 433 years. Kiev, the historic capital of Ukraine, was captured by the pagan Lithuanians in 1362. The Lithuanians then soon afterwards joined up with the Polish monarchs, and the connection of Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine continued until the end of the 18th century with the partitions of Poland, Lithuania in 1795. But to pick a middling date, 1569, the middle of the 16th century, the Union of Lublin, when Poland and Lithuania changed from being a dynastic state into being a constitutional commonwealth. In 1569, the whole of Ukraine lay inside the Kingdom of Poland. And for the next 220 years, chunks of Ukraine were bitten off and swallowed by the Grand Duchy of Moscow, later the Russian Empire, and later by the Soviet Union. Three dates are relevant in this story. 1667, when eastern Ukraine, east of the Dnieper, including Kiev, were ceded to Moscow. Much of this was recovered, but that was, if you like, the first big bite that the Russians made. The second, 1793 to 5, the second and third partitions of Poland, central Ukraine, the biggest part of Ukraine, was ceded to the Russian Empire. And finally, in 1939, the beginning of the Second World War, East Galicia, what the Ukrainians call West Ukraine, the last bite of the cherry, East Galicia with the city of Lvov or Lviv, was seized by Stalin and added to the USSR. So over that period, the whole of Ukraine started off inside the Kingdom of Poland and ended up in the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. Now the second heading, Ukrainian or rather Ruthenian experiences under Polish rule. I should say that the Ukrainian label was not used by Ukrainians in Polish times. They traditionally call themselves Ruthenians, Rusi, and it was only under Russian rule that they changed their name to Ukrainian to avoid the labels which the Russians were giving them. Ruthenian experiences under Polish rule. I'm afraid I'm rushing along and I can only give you a list of headings, but I hope it will add up to indicate what was happening. The first major experience was the Polonization of the Ukrainian nobility. which left Ruthenian society, if you like, the Ukrainian peasantries, decapitated and largely enserfed in the traditional feudal manner. Next, the rise of the Dnieper Cossacks and of the short-lived Cossack hetmanate, which was a reaction against feudal Polish rule and an emblem of later Ukrainian liberty and freedom. The Cossacks, however, like everybody else, fell under Muscovite control. Next, of considerable importance, the introduction by the Polish kings of a large Jewish community, unique in Europe, giving rise in Ukraine to the three-sided ethnic triangle of Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews. This ethnic triangle is not very well understood, but it's, I think, essential. Most people think of Jews being opposed, as it were, by the others, by the other ethnic groups. But what actually happened in a triangular situation was that two of the national groups would gang up against the others in all sorts of ways, so that the Ukrainian peasantry, the Ruthenian peasantry, thought that the Poles and the Jews had ganged up against them. The Poles thought that the Jews and the Ukrainians had ganged up against them. And the Jewish perspective was that both the Poles and the Ukrainians were, if you like, anti-Semitic, ganged up against them. But no one of those three perspectives can be understood without the others. The next heading is the establishment in Ukraine of religious denominations, notably the Byzantine Orthodox Church and the Greek Catholic Church, which were fearful of domination by the Muscovites and the Patriarch of Moscow. And this is a religious conflict which is very active to the present day. Putin is a leader of the Russian Orthodox Church, and if he regains control of Ukraine, a renewed religious persecution will begin. The next heading is the modification of the Ruthenian language, Ruski, to include many Polish elements. Again, this language was not called Ukrainian until modern times. It is in origins similar to Russian, but is not a derivative of Russian. If anything, Russian is a derivative of Old Ruthenian. Although Polish is slightly more distant, Ukrainian has a large number of Polish words, Polish phrases, which, if you know Polish, are immediately recognizable as soon as President Zelensky opens his mouth. And so I could go on. There was a flood of West European influences coming into Ukraine via Poland in art, in architecture, in political thought, influences which were never experienced in Moscow. Now, to race on, I'm afraid. Ruthenian stroke Ukrainian experiences under Russian rule from 1795 onwards. Nearly all, one has to say, bad experiences. Top of the list, the Russification of the old Ukrainian nobility, which had been largely Polonized, but it now became Russified, either by dispossession of the former nobles or by land grants to loyalists and to conformists with Russian laws. Then the subjugation of the Cossacks, who were the Dnieper Cossacks, who were the standard bearers of Ukrainian freedom, and they became, as is well known, agents of the Russian Empire. They were used right across the Russian Empire to keep order in distant places. Now, the belated emancipation of the serfs in the 1860s, the last of such emancipations, which in many ways was an emancipation in name, but not in substance. The peasantry was very grand until quite modern times. Stalin, among others, treated them with particular severity. The imposition of a Pale of Settlement for Jews. Under Russian rule in the 19th century, Jews were not permitted legally to live anywhere except in the area of the former Poland where they had traditionally lived. This was one of many impositions on the Jewish community, and it was, I think, unique to the Russian Empire. Of course, some Jews evaded the law. They went to live in Moscow or St. Petersburg, or indeed in Odessa in the south. But in the 1880s, when the so-called May laws were instituted, forcing Jews to return to the Pale of Settlement, this caused great distress, and of course the biggest wave of Jewish emigration there has been. In parallel to, as it were, to the maltreatment of Jews, you have the maltreatment of the non-Russian Orthodox Christian communities, in particular the Greek Catholic Uniates, who were treated by the Russians and by Stalin later, not only as heretics, but as traitors. And this is a very long and bloody story. The suppression of the Ruthenian language, Ukrainian as it was becoming to be known, and the promotion by Russian bureaucracy of so-called Little Russian identity. This is the cause of the Ruthenians changing their names to Ukrainian. They were officially supposed to admit to being Little Russians, which is a very dismissive phrase. As I've said, they had very different traditions, and in reaction to this attempt by the Russian Empire to turn them into little Russians, they began to call themselves Ukrainians. And you'll note that the center point of Vladimir Putin's grotesque view of history is that the Russians and the Ukrainians are one people. In a way, he's reverted to the attitudes of the Tsarist bureaucracy 200 years ago. All the Western influences which had flooded in under Polish rule were, of course, blocked once the Russian Empire was established. One should mention the beginnings of industrialization, in particular in the Donbass in the mid-19th century, the beginnings of coal, iron, and steel, and very typically, it is exactly this area which has, which Putin has been trying to reclaim as being part of Russia. Last on this list, I'll mention 1914, the beginning of the First World War, the barbarous attack of the Russian army on Western Ukraine and the occupation of the city of Lviv. This was reminiscent of things which are happening in Ukraine today. Great loss of life, great attack of civilians, and as was inevitable in those days, pogroms against the Jewish community. So it's a long list of bad experiences. World War I, Ukraine formed a large part of the battleground between the Russian and German armies, and the scene, of course, of the striking German victory in 1917 to 18. This resulted in 1917, supported by Germany, the creation of an independent Ukraine, authorized not by the Bolsheviks, as Putin says, but by the provisional government of Alexander Kerensky. So World War I was a time of great change. But then we move into the period after World War I. I'm skipping over all sorts of complexities, but the immediate outcome was the creation of Soviet Ukraine, Ukraine as one of the Soviet republics, one of the founding members of the Soviet Union in 1923. Incidentally, the Bolsheviks didn't create the Soviet Union in 1917, as many history books say. So under Soviet Ukraine, you get another list of horrors. First one was the suppression of the independent Soviet Republic, which had been set up by Kerensky in 1917. Next came the reinstatement of the Ukrainian language by Stalin. And it was said that you could speak Ukrainian as long as you didn't say anything of importance in it. This was, if you like, religious freedom without the freedom of expression, the freedom to say anything of importance. But nonetheless, the Ukrainian language was re-established, and it did educate a generation, more than a couple of generations of native Ukrainian speakers. In 1929 came the forced collectivization of agriculture, in which many millions of peasants were killed or deported. And of course, Ukraine was the most fertile agricultural region of the Soviet Union, as it had been of the Russian Empire. And the misery of the peasants after 1929 is too horrid to be described. But in 1932-3 came another great atrocity, the Holodomor, the terror famine, in which Stalin deliberately starved to death over 4 million Ukrainians, a genocide in proportions approaching that of the Holocaust, and yet an atrocity which was successfully covered up at the time, and has only certainly in my lifetime been properly documented. 1937-38, you have the Great Terror, where hundreds of thousands of Russians and Ukrainians, all Soviet citizens, were done to death for no apparent reason at all. Stalin got something which Hitler never did, of killing people by numbers, simply issuing orders to the NKVD to kill 50,000 in that district, 40,000 there, 100,000 there. Absolutely appalling barbarity that is hard to equal. And last of my list, I'm sure it isn't the full story, but in 1939-40, at the beginning of the Second World War, there was a mass deportation of Poles by Stalin. Over 2 million Poles were deported to Siberia, and many, of course, were dead within a year. The average life expectancy in those Siberian camps was 1 winter. And then we come to World War II, which of course deserves much more than the very rapid treatment I have to give it. But there are 1 or 2 sort of elementary facts which are rarely understood. Ukraine was the cockpit of the Soviet-German war, this titanic war on the Eastern Front between the Nazi-run Wehrmacht and the Soviet Red Army. The death toll by the war and by events during the war was astronomical. At least 1.5 million Jews were murdered in Ukraine during the Holocaust, and about 10 million Ukrainian civilians were also killed by one means or another. It's important to realize that Germans didn't occupy Russia. What they occupied was the Baltic states, Belarus, and Ukraine. And Ukraine was the biggest chunk of it. And that's where most civilians died. And yet one constantly hears this red herring of 27 million Russians being killed in the war. It wasn't Russians, it was 27 million Soviet citizens from all the 15 republics. And the biggest chunk of civilians were Ukrainian dead. At the end of the war, Stalinism was reimposed with all its consequences. The last remaining Poles of Ukraine were expelled en masse, and to complete the picture, the Ukrainian nationalists who had attempted to revise Ukrainian fortunes before and during the war were scourged and eliminated. Here one has to make an important distinction. In Soviet speak, in the way that the Soviets talk, and this includes Putin, anybody who opposed the Soviet Russian authorities is described as a fascist. In our language, that doesn't mean they were fascists. There was a small group of Ukrainians who were fascists, but the Russian terminology describes anybody, democratic, religious, Jewish, Polish, anybody who was a political dissident is called a fascist. You note that Putin is calling Volodymyr Zelensky a fascist or a Nazi, which is grotesque. But this language complicates all the discussions we have about the Second World War on the Eastern Front. Incidentally, while we're talking about fascists and collaborators, by far the biggest formation, more than 1 million strong, was the Vlasov army, the Russian National Liberation Army, consisting largely of Russians, not Ukrainians, far more Russian fascists and collaborators than there were Ukrainians. Now, I've reached the point where I was originally going to start talking about cultural assimilation. It's absolutely natural that 400 years of Polish rule, 300 years of Russian rule had their effects. In other words, in its simplest form, we're talking about Russification, and of course the limits of Russification. Incidentally, I'm not talking about linguistic assimilation or racial assimilation. There are many other contexts in which the term assimilation is used. I'm very uncomfortable about this because I'm compressing an hour's lecture into 4 or 5 minutes. But speaking to an American audience, the baseline for any discussion of these matters must be Americanization, namely the well-known process whereby millions of immigrants to the USA were culturally homogenized, especially by public education, i.e. painlessly, not by forcible assimilation. The so-called melting pot, a phrase coined by a British-born Polish Jew called Israel Zangwill in a play in 1908 attended by the first President Roosevelt. Now, what is clear from those experiences 100 years ago of Americanization, it is quite possible in 1 or 2 generations to transform the cultural orientation, the native language, and the loyalties of a population. It's quite possible. and let me just stress that so two aspects of assimilation that I mentioned, that there's much more to it than this, but language is one and loyalty is the other. If you like, in the US context, it's teaching immigrants to speak English, to become English-speaking Americans. And that has, of course, been hugely successful, at least until the Latinos came along, and they don't seem quite as keen to accept English as all the others did. But in parallel to that is loyalty. In the American context, this is teaching children to salute the flag, to sing this, whatever, the Star Spangled Banner, to build up a loyalty to their new country. And one has to say that although these two aspects have enjoyed much success in the American context, elsewhere, it isn't true that linguistic assimilation goes hand in hand with new loyalties. As a British person, I give you the obvious example of Ireland, which was subject to English rule, English rule, for, well, whatever, since the 12th century. And 95% of the population has been assimilated into the English language. The overwhelming majority of Irish people speak English, but by God, they aren't English people. Their loyalty is not to England. They have their own republic, they have their own traditions, and their loyalties are very clearly Irish. And this is a very good parallel to understand Ukraine. It's about 30%, possibly a bit more, of the population of Ukraine who have become native Russian speakers. The capital of Ukraine, Kiev, or Kiev, Kiev is Ukrainian. Kiev, of course, is Russian. And as usual, we have learned about these things via Russia. But the fact that a third of the population speaks Russian does not mean that they are dying to be ruled by Russia. Quite the opposite. They're like the Irish. Whether they speak Ukrainian or Russian, they want to be free of Russia. And I think everybody's seen it on their screens, the extraordinary determination of the Ukrainians during this invasion to resist the brute force of Putin. And of course, the man who has attracted most attention, the president Volodymyr Zelensky, is a native Russian speaker. When he appears on television, he's speaking either to the British House of Commons or I think recently to the American Congress. He's speaking Russian, not Ukrainian. But his loyalty is transparently not to Russia, but to Ukraine. In other words, assimilation, whether we're talking about Americanization in North America, Russification in Eastern Europe, Polonization, Germanization, and all the others, are never totally effective. There's a wide spectrum of assimilatory efficiency, and Ukraine is no exception. The level of assimilation in Ukraine varies, I think, according to sectors. For example, the linguistic sector might be 30%. The religious sector is something similar. The majority of Ukrainian Christians have rejected the Russian Orthodox Church. And of course, in 1991, the first time there was a free vote, 90% of the population of Ukraine voted for independence. It's an overwhelming popular decision. Now, I know I started a bit late. You must stop me if I go on too long, but I have a couple of additional comments about assimilation. A central delusion of Vladimir Putin is that the assimilation of Russians and Ukrainians was complete. Well, it's absolute nonsense. It's grotesque. It simply is not true. The other comment about assimilation refers to the Jewish community, where assimilation was an extremely important topic in the 19th and 20th centuries. 85% of all the Jews in the modern world can trace their origins to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth before the partitions in the 18th century. But afterwards, that pool of Jewish people was assimilated into various ruling cultures. One part of them became German Jews. Before the late 18th century, there were no German Jews. Part of them became Russian Jews. Before the partitions of Poland, there were no Russian Jews. Russia wouldn't have any Jews. So the Russian Jews are the result of assimilation of usually Yiddish-speaking Jews from Poland. And then, of course, there was Polonization. There was another part of the Jewish population which was assimilated into Polish culture. And this was particularly marked in the interwar period, that the big cities of Poland, Warsaw, Kraków, Lwów, now Lviv, but Lwów, had very large Jewish communities who were largely Polonized. They were Poles of Jewish descent. You should look at New York City, the range of different levels of assimilation. And there's not time to go into the Holocaust, but one thing that is little known about the Holocaust is that the Nazi definition of Jewishness is widely accepted without questioning, and yet a lot of the people who were killed, murdered during the Holocaust would not have regarded themselves as Jews. They were people who had been assimilated, most usually into Polish culture, but who were regarded by the Nazis as having a Jewish forebear, and therefore they fell into the net. In the largest Nazi ghetto, the Warsaw Ghetto, there was a whole district of Catholics who the Nazis regarded as Jews. These Catholics didn't think of themselves as Jewish. Some of them didn't even know they had, a Jewish grandmother or whatever. but there's a whole district of the ghetto was Catholic. There's Catholic churches where the priests and the congregation were entirely Polish Catholics, and yet the Nazis regarded them as Jewish and murdered them along with all the others. I think my final category, if that's all right, final heading is called the crystallization of national identity. National movements sprang up right across Europe, everywhere in Europe in the mid-19th century, each of them proceeding to create nationally conscious communities at different tempos and with different degrees of success. In Eastern Europe, one sees German, Russian, Polish, Ukrainian, Jewish and other nationalisms competing. The strongest of them, the German national movement, acts as a role model for many of the others. The weakest of them, perhaps the Belarusian national movement, is suppressed and never heard of again. Incidentally, Stalin murdered the first generation of Belarusian intellectuals. Among the more successful national movements, each of them progressive unsteadily until reaching a moment of crystallization when a critical mass of the constituency accepts the national identification. This moment happened in Germany in 1871 when the German Empire was created, and of course the Prussians who ruled Germany put their weight behind the national movement. It happened in Poland in 1918 to 20 after the creation of Polish, restoration of Polish independence, and it was delayed 2 or 3 times in Ukraine until 1991. Incidentally, in the Russian case, the crystallization of Russian national identity, which began in the mid-19th century, was delayed in the 20th century by the appearance of a rival phenomenon, Sovietization, the attempts to create a new Soviet identity, a supranational identity involving all the 15 republics of the Union. And oddly enough, it's only after the collapse of the Soviet Union that Russian identity has crystallized as ferociously as it has under Vladimir Putin. In Ukraine, 30 years of independence since 1991 have gradually strengthened national identity. It has been a process of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and so on. But what one can say, I think, without hesitation, is that the present invasion of Ukraine has provided the moment when Ukrainian national identity has finally been crystallized. Putin, in opposition to what he intends, is actually forging the steel of Ukrainian identity, which will last much longer than the present episode. So to conclude, Poland was subject to foreign rule for something like 150 years. Ukraine was subjected to foreign rule to 700 years, 400 under Poland, 300 under Russia. Today, both Poland and Ukraine have entered the phase of their history when they are both capable of supporting an independent sovereign existence. And it's exactly for that reason, that a desperate Vladimir Putin has chosen to attack Ukraine and to force changes on it. However, please step back a moment and evaluate how very limited Putin's successes have been. Ill-informed commentators say that Putin is rebuilding the Russian Empire or restoring the Soviet Union. That is a gross exaggeration. In the 14 years since he went on the warpath, Putin has not reclaimed the republics of Central Asia. Except for two tiny slices, he has not recovered the republics of the Caucasus. He has no hope of laying his hands on Poland, the Baltic states, and other members of the former Soviet bloc. And in 8 years of war against Ukraine, he has seized one seaside peninsula, one of Ukraine's 20 cities, 2 small industrial districts, and perhaps 5 to 10% of the territory as a whole. Putin is not winning. If he did ever have a dream of reviving a great empire like Peter the Great, that dream is in ruins. And given proper support, Ukraine will prevail. Thank you. Good. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Still there?
Yes,
Okay,
we can
good.
hear you.
I'm talking to a very small computer, which is hello.
Always like predicted like at least.
Thank you very much, Dr. Davies. That was an incredible speech. And everyone already joined me in giving you a round of applause. So thank you again. Now we can move on to the Q&A section. So everybody on the bottom bar of the Zoom, there's a button called reactions. If you press on that, you'll see an option to click raise hand. And so that's how we're going to be doing this. Alternatively, if you really struggle with that, I can also be looking through the gallery to see if anyone's actually just physically raising their hand. So with that said, I see we already have one question from Mr. Hittinger. So Mr. Hittinger, if you'd like to ask your question.
Yes, thank you, Professor Davies. John Hittinger, I'm a director of the John Paul II Institute in Houston, Texas, and we love your work and appreciate this talk. I wanted to ask you about the importance of the religious diversity in Ukraine now, the fact that we do have Roman Catholics, the Uniads, the autocephalous Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and that schism when the Russian Church would no longer commune with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Wasn't this a sign of what was coming? And secondly, would you say Europe and the United States are pretty blind to these questions of the importance of religion and make it difficult for us to know what's going on in this war? Thank you.
Well, my answer is yes and yes. I think the West is very poorly informed about the religious map of Eastern Europe. This is partly due to the fact that, as I said right at the beginning, that the Russian version of events is far better known, far better publicized, than anything else. Most of our Slavic departments are heavily dominated by Russianists, and as it were, the Russian version of events is much more widely propagated. And we tend to deal with stereotypes, stereotypes like, all Poles are Roman Catholics. Well, a lot of Poles are Roman Catholics, but not all of them. The religious map in Poland is actually quite complicated. It's certainly very complicated in Ukraine. Ukraine is a very big country by European standards. I said it's like Texas, but it's had a lot of influences, but throughout the last 3 centuries, all Russian governments, including the Soviet government, have tried to enforce religious homogeneity on Ukraine. They have repeatedly, from the 19th century onwards, they have repeatedly forced, by bloody, brutal force, killing people, deporting priests and so on. They have tried to turn all Ukrainians into Russian Orthodox. And this means repeated attacks on the Greek Catholics, the Uniates, and of course on the Byzantine, the Greek Orthodox, who recognize the Patriarch of Constantinople, and on others, and the religious diversity is one of the sources of resistance in Ukraine to Russian rule. And there's this terrible background of religious persecution. Not in my lifetime, Stalin was killing Greek Catholics in Western Ukraine, where my wife's family came from. And people remember these things. So one of the first things that happened after 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, was that religious freedom broke out in Ukraine. And this meant that the Greek Catholics who had been banned in the Soviet Union set up shop again. One branch of the Orthodox appointed, I'm not certain it's elected or appointed, their own Ukrainian patriarch, and only a minority of Orthodox in Ukraine recognize the Patriarch of Moscow. But Putin is hand in hand in religious matters with the Russian Orthodox Church, which is extremely intolerant. The Russian Orthodox don't appreciate other Christian denominations, and it's a major source of friction. Now, as to the question of religion in general, I think it's fair to say that because of the very long history of religious persecution in Ukraine, religious identity is stronger than it is in countries where religious freedom has been taken for granted for generations. So this is indeed a primary issue in Ukraine. And it's the memory of religious persecutions, grandmothers telling their grandsons what used to go on in not too distant times, which helps put the backbone into the Ukrainian resistance.
Thank you.
All right, let's see. Dr. Łukaszewski. I think I have to unmute Dr. Łukaszewski. Dr. Łukaszewski, you're muted. If you,
Okay, I'm sorry. Dr. Davies, thank you very much for a very insightful and very informative presentation, and so much relevant to today's events in that region. I have two questions. One quick question is, what impact current events, the reception of Ukrainian refugees in Poland, will have on the future, in your estimation, and future relations with Ukrainians in the broadest sense, not only inter-ethnic, but also security. In the background of my question is the proposed security structure, including Ukraine, Turkey, US, and Poland. How will this shape it, in your estimation? And the second question is related to your interview with Dr. Frost recently, in which you said that every historian has an intellectual filter through which he sees history and writes it. And my question is, if I may ask it, what is your filter? How do you describe your own filter through which you see history? Thank you very much again.
Wow. Refugees, I think that this tremendous influx of refugees is going to have an impact in all sorts of sectors. It's changing almost at a stroke Polish-Ukrainian relations. As I say, many Poles, many Polish families have bitter memories of their expulsion, their persecution in Ukraine, both by Stalin and in some instances by Ukrainian nationalists. And those bitter memories die hard, but they seem to have been overcome almost at a stroke by this crisis. Poles, as never before, have been opening their houses to Ukrainian refugees by the hundreds of thousands. It's they're not dribs and drabs. I had a phone call this morning from Krakow saying that it's incredible that 10,000 Ukrainians milling around outside the station in the afternoon, and by the evening they've all been taken in. There's no refugee camps in Krakow, but people simply coming down to the station with their car or their van and saying, hop in, taking people home. So this impact is going to be, I think, fundamental. I should say that in the last 10 years or so, or perhaps 15 years, Poland has received a lot of Ukrainian workers. Once Poland joined the European Union, masses of Polish workers went off especially to Britain. We've got 1 million Poles in Great Britain at the moment. And their place in Poland was taken by Ukrainians. So Polish-Ukrainian relations have been gradually improving as people became more familiar with each other. But the recent crisis has overwhelmed everything. There's signs being made there. Is it to me? Sorry, I can't hear anything. The other part of the question was about security. This is not really one of my areas, and it is a sector which is changing very fast. The security structures of Eastern Europe have been very closely limited to NATO. But I think everybody sees that the present arrangements are unsatisfactory, and some new configuration is going to emerge. You mentioned Turkey, which is a member of NATO, but a rather special case. Poland being the largest of the frontline NATO states, and of course the Americans being the overall lords of NATO. They are going to have to come to some new arrangement. What it'll be, I can't say. But generally speaking, this crisis is shaking everybody up. If people were had other things in mind, that they're now concentrating on the essentials.
All right.
Okay.
Ms. Hunt and Dr. Davies, just let us know how many more questions you'd like to take. We know that we're already,
I will take the punishment as long as I can.
Hello?
yes.
Am
Ms.
I
Hunt.
Hello,
on?
yes,
Can you hear me?
yes.
If you will allow me, it's a kind of a personal story or question. First of all, thank you, Dr. Davies. Over the years, I've always felt you were the one person in the West who understands the Polish soul. In reading your works, I always felt a kinship. I thought you were Polish at one time, but of course you're not. But anyway.
I'm a Polish citizen.
Oh, you are?
I am a Polish citizen, yes.
Great. Anyway.
But not by birth, no.
But not by birth. So as I said, I think you understand the Polish soul, and that always gave me comfort, being an emigre myself in exile. What I wanted to tell you, and I will be very brief, my family comes from Przemyśl and Sokal. Sokal is now part of Ukraine. Przemyśl, of course, is the gateway of the Ukrainians now moving into Poland, from what I hear. My family was, I don't know whether it was typical, but my mother's father was Ukrainian. My mother's mother was Polish. They had 6 children, 3 boys, 3 girls. The 3 boys identified as Ukrainians. The 3 girls identified as Polish. I didn't know that until I came to the United States to be reunited with an uncle. And there I realized how very different they had been. And I must say, I don't know if it's a typical story, but it was a source of distress for me to see let's say the national enthusiasm on each side. But I am so pleased now to hear about how warmly Poland is welcoming Ukrainians. I feel like they're our brother. I've always felt they're like our brothers. We're not one, but we are one in many ways. And I am part of it. So would you say my experience, my mother's experience, was typical of the Ukrainian-Polish not assimilation, but actual marriage, the union, and then the product of this union, where in my case, it was a lot of stress, I must say, because I love the Ukrainian music. I loved all that, but I was really Polish.
Mhm. Okay, this is the making of another lecture. But your question, is that typical? It's very typical of that region of Poland. I've just written the history of Galicia, which, as you probably know, the Austro-Hungarian Galicia, which was half Polish and half Ukrainian. The dividing line was along the River San near Przemyśl. So you're right in the middle of this Polish-Ukrainian complex. Can you hear me? Am I? Here we are again. Yes. Okay. A very important thing for you to understand, and it's in my wife's family as well. The Ukrainians of East Galicia were mainly Greek Catholics. All right. The Poles were mainly Roman Catholics, but the two branches of Catholic Church had intercommunion. That meant that Poles and Ukrainians could intermarry without any obstacle. The Catholic Church was not very keen on intermarriage, but in this case, there was no barrier at all. So that many families in that region didn't know whether they were Polish or Ukrainian. Mother belonged to one religion and one linguistic group, and father to another, that was, as it were, the natural order of things. When I was a student in Oxford, I met a gentleman who came exactly from your area, from Yarosław, and he was a judge, and he described the conditions before the war in the countryside in your region, and the peasantry, the Polish and Ukrainian peasantry, habitually intermarried. If there was a Polish village with a Roman Catholic church, a Polish girl would usually marry a Ukrainian from the neighboring village and become a Greek Catholic. But similarly, Greek Catholic girls could marry a Polish man, and in both villages, the Ukrainians and the Poles, the Roman Catholics and the Greek Catholics were all mixed up together. They could all speak both languages. It was a sort of bi-religious, bi-ethnic, bi-cultural existence. I could tell you a lot more about all of that, but that, as it were, was normal in those parts. But one of the sad things that happened is in emigration. When people emigrated, for example, from Przemyśl, from Galicia, they would go to the frontier at Oświęcim. They would get on a train, they would go to Hamburg and sail off to America, usually in the company of Polish, Ukrainian, Jewish people, all from the same area on the same boat. But the minute they landed in America, they all went in different directions. The Poles would go to Polish-American parishes, right? The Ukrainians would go to Ukrainian communities. Very often they would go up to Canada rather than to America. And of course, the Jewish people who were neighbors in Przemyśl or Krakow or Lvov, they would go to Jewish communities wherever, and they would lose the sense of being related to all the others. And I think in emigration, there was more distress and sort of conflict than there was at home. Anyhow, I can't go on too much. I think I have to contest what you talked about in the Polish soul. I'm not certain whether Polish souls exist. It's a bit like the Slavic soul, isn't it? Which that's a bit of a dubious category. I don't know. I'm just writing an essay about Chopin, and that's when you begin to believe that there really was a Polish soul. Good. Well, are there any more questions or?
Yes, there are 4 other questions. So once again, just let us know whenever you would like to cut the Q&A off. The next question, I'm just doing this in the order that it came. The next question is from my dad, Robert Silverstein.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you very well.
Thank you, Dr. Davies, very much for your tremendous talk. I wanted to also start on a bit of a personal note, just to let you know that God's Playground not only is the amazing work that it is, but I purchased it many years ago to impress my Polish then girlfriend and future wife. So I wanted to thank you for being a part of our family in a way that I don't know if you've ever heard that compliment before, but it is both an intellectual work and also something that affected us in a personal way too. But I wanted to ask this question. Towards the end of your comments, you said that given the proper support, Ukraine will prevail. And I wanted to ask you, given what we are seeing real time, these world shifting events unfold, if you could speak to President Biden, what would you urge him to do now before it's too late to give proper support to Ukraine?
Wow, big question. Well, the first question, I've had many stories about God's Playground. As you probably know, it became compulsory reading in Poland, so that every young person who read for the Matura or went to university read God's Playground. So I have millions of readers. And quite often married couples would fight over it. I remember one couple, one woman ringing me up saying that, you know, we've got a copy of God's Playground, but my husband is always reading it. So I had to send her a second copy so that they could each sit in bed and read their copy of God's Playground. But yes, it's had a remarkable history until the present government of Poland, of course, which has crossed me off their reading list. But that is perhaps a badge of honor. Now, oh dear, I very much hesitate to advise President Biden. As you know, the big problem with Putin is that he has the biggest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world. And I don't think he's mad, but he's certainly desperate. His dreams are all falling apart, and people in that state of mind, you know, really can be dangerous. I think President Biden has done exactly the right thing by talking to China. China is 10 times stronger than Russia. Russia is a very weak state. its economy is the same as much smaller states. The GDP of Russia is considerably lower than that of Poland per capita. And Putin is, gosh, I think I've been cut off.
No, you're there.
Am I still there?
Yes.
Yes.
I've lost my picture, but okay. Yeah,
We can see you.
Russia is very weak. China is very strong, and China is taking the place of Russia as it were, the second superpower in the globe. So Biden is quite correct to talk to the Chinese. I think he's wrong if he's, as it were, threatening the Chinese in some way, not to help Russia. He should be encouraging the Chinese to play a mediating role and to rein the Russians in, because the Chinese can do that much more satisfactorily than the Americans could. The immediate need, of course, is to provide effective defensive weapons for Ukraine, but that seems to have happened. The dilapidated state of the Russian army is hard to believe, but the Ukrainians seem to have had no difficulty in holding it up. Putin's army is nowhere near being able to occupy Ukraine. They've only got a tiny corner of Ukraine, and they're not making much progress as it is. So it's very difficult to know what the outcome of all that will be. But the other factor, which is obvious, is that with every atrocity, the Russians are strengthening Ukrainian identity. And even if Russia should temporarily establish some measure of control over Ukraine, it won't last long. I think there's a growing possibility that Putin will be overthrown. That the Russians themselves will gradually understand what's going on, and the whole thing is going to collapse. And I think an independent Ukraine is going to be confirmed. It may have some limits on its military position. It may have to accept some form of neutrality. I don't know. But I think Zelensky is pretty smart, and he's smart because he understands the solid support that he has. I think we have to keep our cool. I don't think Putin has any hope of attacking NATO. NATO is much, much stronger, and of course he's nuclear armed. Putin can't touch NATO, and his attempt to invade Ukraine has been pretty pathetic. I don't think it will last. Well, that's a part answer, Mr. Silberstein. I wasn't ready for I don't usually comment on current affairs, less about the future, but.
Thank you. I thought that was a wonderful response. Thank you.
Good. Well, I'm good to have a happy customer.
All right, next question from Mr. Bartoszewski.
Incidentally, I can't see anybody. Oh, here we are again. I can.
All right, I guess he is not there anymore. Next question from Mr. Mazurek.
Professor Davies, thank you very much for a very enlightening lecture. I'm calling from Baltimore, Maryland. I'm with the Polish Heritage Association of Maryland and the National Katyn Memorial Foundation, and a librarian of the Polish National Alliance Council here in Baltimore. My question goes back a little bit in history. I wonder if you could speak to Pilsudski and Petlura, their
Right.
plans to try to have a federation of Poland and Ukraine after uh, the Civil War in
Yeah.
1919. Was that ever really viable, do you think?
Gosh, this is one of the big ifs of history. Pilsudski took control of independent Poland at the end of 1918, much at the same time as independent Ukraine was established. And they were natural allies against the Bolsheviks, in that the Bolsheviks were trying to overthrow both independent Poland and independent Ukraine. And during the War of 1920, when Lenin sent his Red Army into Poland, Pilsudski made an alliance with Petlura, and the Polish army marched to Kiev. Kiev, okay. In nearly all the English language history books, the march to Kiev is called Poland invading Russia. Most people don't understand that Kiev was not in Russia in 1920. It was the capital of independent Ukraine. So the whole discussion starts, on false premises. The problem was that Petlura in Ukraine was not in strong enough not in a strong enough position to defend himself. And the Bolsheviks overthrew the independent Republic of Ukraine, whereas they failed miserably, as you know, in Warsaw. Now, in terms of wider strategy, Pilsudski, as the leader of the largest, what they call the border states, the border of Russia, he tried to form a federation of border states from Finland in the north all the way to Georgia. And this didn't come about for a number of reasons, partly because some of the potential members, like Ukraine, couldn't defend themselves. But there were other, like the real difficulty was with the Lithuanians. The Lithuanians wouldn't ally with the Poles because of the question of Vilna, which was largely a Polish city, but which they regarded as the capital of Lithuania. And the Lithuanians just were impossible to persuade that that they should join the bigger picture of defending themselves against the Bolsheviks than fighting over one city. And the the divisions between these border states led to their downfall. In due course, Stalin picked them all off one by one. And not only did Pilsudski's federation never take off, the whole of independent Eastern Europe was overthrown in 1939 and divided up between Hitler and Stalin. So whether it could have been different, I don't know. But Pilsudski on his own was not able diplomatically to organize these border states into an effective federation. And though he defended Poland effectively, he couldn't defend all those states from the Bolsheviks. And some countries like Finland defended themselves. The Finns were brilliant, both then and again in 1939. But some of the countries, especially Ukraine, was very large, was unwieldy, was very divided. The Ukrainians were fighting amongst themselves, and they couldn't get things in order to repel the Bolsheviks. So Ukraine fell to the Soviet Union.
Thank you, Professor. Bardzo dziękuję.
Nie ma za co.
Next question is from Miss Yarin.
Hi, thanks. I was wondering if you could give any brief comments about the assimilation of Germans within Poland, Ukraine.
Right, assimilation of Germans. Well, the German population in Poland was largely in the West. The city of Poznań, Wielka Polska, if you know what we're talking about, was a very important part of Prussia and was heavily Germanized, so that when Poland became independent, there was this solid block of Germans in Wielka Polska. Łódź was another city where Łódź was very interesting. It's the main textile city in Poland. The pre-war population was 1/3 Polish, 1/3 German, and 1/3 Jewish. And the famous novel about three young men, you know, who represent the different ethnic communities. There was also a considerable number of Germans in Galicia, in the Austro-Hungarian part. There were German settlements sent to Galicia by the Habsburgs in the late 18th, early 19th century. And although they diminished, they were still fairly numerous right until the First World War. A lot of those German colonies in Galicia were Polonized. A lot of famous Polish writers were of German origin. Wincenty Pol, I don't know if you know that name, but there were a lot of Galician writers who were Polonized Germans. In Wielka Polska, the German community was much stronger. In Łódź, Łódź was tragic, really, in that when the Second World War came, the Jewish third were rounded up and murdered. The German population took over, and Łódź became Littmannstadt. So it was a short period of Germanization, and then after the war, the German population were expelled. Anyhow, I'm getting into complications. The German question was never reached a clear conclusion before all Germans were expelled from Poland in 1945 as a result of the Potsdam agreements, the Allied agreements. So the question of Polonization of Germans or Germanization of Poles came to an end before it was really resolved. But the German influences in Poland is very strong in all sorts of ways. Germany, whether you want it or not, is Poland's main Western neighbor. And it's extremely influential in all sorts of ways, culturally and economically, politically, you name it. And happy to say, Polish-German relations are greatly improved in recent decades, largely because Germans have transformed their attitudes. Unfortunately, the Russians have not. The Russians are in many ways unreconstructed. Putin has been going backwards, like he's gotten back to the, I don't know, the 18th century. And Russian attitudes are a great barrier to reconciliation. And Polish-Russian relations are nowhere near as good as Polish-German relations.
Mr. Bartoszewski, he was in line earlier. His mic wasn't working. Now he's back on. So.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Davies. So given the enormous influx of Ukrainian refugees into Poland in the recent weeks, we can probably predict that the fates of the Polish and Ukrainian peoples will become more closely connected than ever before. Do you think that this situation creates a need for a sort of formal reconciliation between the Polish and Ukrainian governments over the darkest chapters of our mutual history, much like it was done between France and Germany after World War II, in order to ensure a firm modus operandi of peaceful coexistence in the future?
Well, there's more than one question there. I think we don't know yet how long these Ukrainians are going to be flooding Poland. It is possible that a settlement may come quite soon, and then most of them will go back home. That's what they want to do. Apparently, my friends in Krakow saying they don't want to go further than Krakow because they're hoping to catch the next train back to Ukraine. But if it goes on for a longer time, then there is going to be an ongoing issue. As for sort of historical reconciliation, this has taken place to a considerable extent, at least at sort of official levels and academic levels. I think that a lot of the problem is in popular attitudes. Like my mother-in-law came from Lvov, and I can remember what her views were about Ukrainians. Although the household was full of Ukrainians, and they, there were bilingual households. So I don't think historical reconciliation is as urgent with the Ukrainians as it is with the Russians. But how on earth do you talk to Russians? They are a closed society, and it's very, very difficult to initiate any process of mutual understanding.
All right. I guess this will be our final question for Mr. Dobek. We can't hear you. You're muted, Mr. Dobek.
I can't hear the question.
Yes, we're working on Mr. Dobek unmuting himself. One second, Dr. Davies. There we go. There we go.
Thank you. Thank you, Nathan. And thank you, Dr. Davies, for a wonderful presentation and also for telling my father's story in Trail of Hope. I really appreciate it. There is a narrative that the Ukrainians in 1941 welcomed the Germans as liberators, and in gratitude, the Ukrainians did a lot of the Nazis' dirty work, particularly in the extermination camps. I'm wondering if this is part of the basis for Mr. Putin wanting to denazify the Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You started with Trail of Hope. I get more correspondence about that book than about anything else. There are huge numbers of grandsons and granddaughters these days of soldiers of the Anders Army who are eager to learn more about their forebears, and it's very heartening. This last week, I got to know Lord Daniel Finkelstein, who's a prominent conservative member of the House of Lords and a journalist. And it turns out that his father was a soldier of the Anders Army, and that he's writing his grandfather's biography, which I think will be very much along lines favorable to the Polish views of all that. Now, the other question. You mentioned Ukrainians welcoming the Germans in 1941. I think you have to start a bit earlier. In the First World War, a very different set of Germans supported the Ukrainian national movement. And the German army, having defeated the Russian army, occupied Kiev and protected the infant Ukrainian Republic. So Ukrainians in general had a sort of very positive memories of Germans. And in the interwar period as well, Ukrainian activists who couldn't operate in the Soviet Union often operated from Germany. So in 1941, when the Nazi Wehrmacht invaded Ukraine, advanced into Ukraine, I think it was very natural for Ukrainians to welcome the arrival of the Germans. But under the mistaken delusion that these were the same sort of Germans that had been there 30 years before in the First World War. And what happened, Stepan Bandera, who was the leader of the Ukrainian nationalists, declared an independent Ukrainian republic again in July 1941. And he was promptly locked up by the Gestapo and put in a Nazi concentration camp, played no further part in the war. No, I think that's the end of that story. It's also true that a small number of Ukrainians collaborated with the German Nazis. The Waffen SS, which was the army branch of the SS, recruited one division of Ukrainians. It was called the 15th Grenadier Waffen SS Galician. And that's an incredibly small number of men for a very big nation. There were 3 times as many Hungarians in the Waffen SS, 3 times as many, Swedes and Danes and Norwegians, Frenchmen, Belgians, you name it. All the occupied countries had except for Poland. The Poles never supplied a Waffen SS division. All the other occupied countries did, and Ukraine was special in providing a very small number, 1 division. And these Ukrainian collaborators were not particularly involved in Nazi crimes. I don't think the Waffen SS Galician was involved in Nazi crimes at all. By far the biggest group of collaborators were Russians. General Vlasov, 1 million strong. That's how many times? 20 times more Russians than Ukrainians. But you never hear of it. The Russians talk about Ukrainian fascists like it's nonsense. You mentioned, I think, concentration camp guards. This is another frequent red herring. In 1941 to 44, the Germans took roughly 4 million prisoners of war from the Red Army. And those people were starved to death. They were put in enclosures, given no food or water or shelter, and they were just left to die. And of course, they resorted to all sorts of horrors, cannibalism, and you name it. And then the SS would come along and said, now lads, not feeling a bit hungry, do you want a decent meal? We've got a job for you. And if anybody volunteered, they were given a meal, then put in a uniform and sent as a guard to a concentration camp. These weren't volunteers in the normal sense. These were people coerced into working for the Germans, on pain of death. And these ridiculous prosecutions of concentration guards, as though they were freely recruited and so on, is really outrageous. But for the grace of God, anybody in the control of the Gestapo and the SS could end up as a collaborator. There were, of course, Jewish collaborators in large numbers. All the police in the ghettos were all Jewish. The Gestapo recruited Jewish people. They wouldn't trust Polish police to run the ghettos. And those Jewish police were, of course, coerced that they can't be judged by ordinary standards. And when they had done their job, they were murdered as well. The depravity of the Nazis has to be understood before you start talking about people who willingly joined, the Nazi movement. There were a few, no doubt, but generally speaking, the big numbers were not real volunteers at all. They were people coerced in order to save their lives, are working for these wretched Nazis.
All right, well, that will do it for Q&A. Thank you so much, Dr. Davies, for your time, for your speech, for your thorough responses. We appreciate your kindness, your time, and your wisdom. I think I speak for most, if not all of us here when I say that you're an inspiration to us all, and we are so grateful for all you've done for Poland and Polish history. So thank you so much, and we really appreciate it.
Nathan, may I ask another question, or may I add an addendum?
It's up to
Proszę
Dr.
bardzo.
Davies. Yeah.
May I? I just wanted to kind of add on to what Mr. Dobek said about the trial of hope, because my mother, my sister and my grandmother were deported by the Russians and ended up in Kazakhstan, where I was born during the war.
All
And
right.
then we went with Anders' army. My father was with the army, and we went with the army into the West, of course, into Tehran, Palestine, and then England. So just wanted you to know I'm of that age that I lived through it. And thank you so much. I didn't know about the book, but I'll be very interested. You also mentioned a book, somebody mentioned about Galicia. What was the name
that
of
was,
the book?
well, Trail of Hope is Szlak Nadziei in Polish,
Szlak Nadziei.
and published in English by Osprey Books. It's a fine book. It's a lot of illustrations, and I say it has a lot of readers. I think you'd enjoy that. What was the other thing you said?
Ms. Hunt was
I've-
asking about the book about Galicia.
Oh yes, the book on Galicia is written, but it's sitting in the editorial offices of my publisher in Krakow. And incidentally, one feature of that book is there's a lot of memoirs. I've quoted a lot of memoirs from all sorts of people in Galicia. I've been very careful to not to make it a Polish history. Galicia had a big Polish population, a big Ukrainian population, a big Jewish population. And I've quoted memoirs from each of the communities, including, I might say, quite a number from Przemyśl. Very interesting memoir by the grandmother of Premier Bielecki, Jan Krzysztof Bielecki, who was premier in the 1990s. His grandmother came from Przemyśl and was educated in a Catholic convent in Przemyśl, became a teacher, and I've used her as an example of a young Galician woman. So there'll be something for you to read about all of that. So I think we call it a day. There's just one thing I was going to mention before I started, but we had a technical hitch. If it's possible to transcribe the recording which you made of the meeting, that would be a great help to me. It doesn't have to be done professionally. So, if you can have a gang of students each writing 5 pages, it'll take them a very short time, but it'll be a big help to me if the text can be transcribed, so that I will then send it to my publishers in Krakow, and it will be made available for readers in Poland.
Excellent. We will definitely do that. It's the least we could do to repay you for all your time.
Okay, that will be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Well, nice to meet you. I think I must have a a break after this, but are you all in what? Are you all over Texas, or where are you?
I'm in Austin,
Stefani jest w tej chwili.
Austin, Texas.
Austin,
Right
Texas.
here in UT
Ja go
country.
dobrze pamiętam. Ja właśnie mieszkałem u kolegi, u Rogera Lewisa.
Aha, to właśnie ten pan, który...
Tak, ja go znam, nie wiem,
tak.
40 lat.
No, ja już mam 80 lat.
No to młodziutka.
Młodziutka, prawda? Bardzo dziękuję. To naprawdę był wspaniały dzień dla mnie.
Dobra, bardzo dziękuję. Do widzenia wszystkim.
Do widzenia.
Dziękuję Natanowi.
Do
Tak,
widzenia.
do widzenia.
Do
Dziękujemy.
widzenia, do widzenia.
Dziękuję. Tak, do widzenia.
Do widzenia.